Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the League of Women Voters program on Imbalance of Power, how shifts in power of state government undermine Wisconsin's conservation legacy. Tonight's program is sponsored by 18 League of Women Voters local leagues located across Wisconsin. What started as a joint effort between the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse area and the League of Women Voters of the Greater Chippewa Valley has grown statewide because of the interest and importance of this topic. I'm Robin Schmidt, President of the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse area, and along with Anne Marie McClellan, President of the League of Women Voters of the Greater Chippewa Valley, we thank you for joining us this evening. The League of Women Voters brings educational and informative programs throughout the year that relate to our mission of empowering voters and defending our democracy. The League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan political organization, encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We take action on public policy positions that are established through member study and consensus. As an organization, we never support or oppose any political party or candidate. As for the logistics of today's presentation, we ask that you type your questions for the speakers as you think of them into the question box at the bottom of your screen. When the speakers have concluded their presentation, Anne Marie will have time to lead a question and answer session for the group. This program is being recorded and it will be available for viewing on local league websites throughout the state. So, on to tonight's presentation. Wisconsin Greenfire is also a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to advance science-informed analysis and policy solutions that address Wisconsin's greatest conservation challenges. Tonight's program is based on a recent Opportunities Now report that was published by Wisconsin Greenfire titled Imbalance of Power, How Shifts in State Government Undermine Wisconsin's Conservation Legacy. The Opportunities Now series of reports by Wisconsin Greenfire provide an analysis of priority issues and actions on a variety of natural resources topics. Anne Marie will put the links to this document and to the Wisconsin Greenfire website in the chat box below for reference for you. Fred Clark is Wisconsin Greenfire's Executive Director with more than 30 years of experience in Wisconsin conservation. His background is rooted in forestry science, having served as the director of the Forest Stewards Guild and as a forester for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He was appointed by both Governor Doyle and Governor Walker to the Wisconsin Council on Forestry from 2004 to 2014. He served 3 terms as a representative to the Wisconsin State Assembly between 2009 and 2014, representing Sauk and Columbia counties. Paul Heinen is the Wisconsin Greenfire Legislative Liaison, working closely with Wisconsin Greenfire work groups to share their expertise and knowledge with policymakers and their staff. He coordinates with other conservation and environmental groups across the state. Paul started his career as a legislative aide to the chair of the Senate Natural Resources Energy Committee and served as the legislative liaison for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for over 34 years. His work to pass hundreds of new laws, including the recycling program, the first groundwater bill in the United States, the stewardship program, and numerous deer and wildlife management program changes. Mark Timke will be joining us through a recorded presentation as he's not able to join us live this evening. Mark earned an undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin Green Bay and a law degree from Duke University. He worked as an environmental attorney from 1979 to 2021 and served on numerous DNR advisory committees, including ones focused on the development of Wisconsin's water quality regulations and PCB regulations. He was an advisor in the formation of the redevelopment and remediation redevelopment program within the DNR, and he helped develop and revise the DNR remediation and brownfields rules. He currently serves on the DNR PFAS Advisory Committee and the DNR Economic Development and Green Environment Advisory Committee. He served as co-chair of Wisconsin Brownfield Study Group from 1998 to 2022. So that's background on our speakers, and I think at this point we'll go ahead and turn it over to Fred to start your presentation. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Robin, and good to not see, but good to know that all 185 of you are there for our program tonight. Paul and I are really excited about sharing some of the work that we did in the last year around this issue in the report that we've called Imbalance of Power. And my first challenge now will be to see if I can share my screen successfully. So let's give that a whirl. Let's see. Can you see the full screen there?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
There you go.
How does that look? Good?
Sure.
Okay. So the report Imbalance of Power that we released in October of last year is one of a series of papers that we call Opportunities Now. And they're basically analysis of different environmental and conservation issues around the state. And if you care to learn more about other work we've done in that series, you can go to our website and you can see other work around everything ranging from white-tailed deer to conservation of wolves, to managing PFAS chemicals in Wisconsin, to protecting wetlands, and some of our work on climate change and energy. Wisconsin's Greenfire is we are a volunteer-driven organization made up primarily of conservation professionals and committed citizens who lend their talent and expertise to help us address a wide spectrum of environmental conservation issues in Wisconsin and fulfill the mission that Robin described. Our membership's open to all who care about these issues, and you can learn more about the variety of work we do at our website. So in this paper, Imbalance of Power, we wanted to try to get at some of the really systemic causes of what so many of us have seen as environmental failures over the last, well, more than a decade now, but since 2011. And many of us, and I know that many of you on the webinar tonight have watched oftentimes with dismay as we've sort of lost battle after battle for better environmental protection and for the conservation tradition that really has made Wisconsin a national leader for much of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. And we've done extensive work on single issues, like wetlands, like what we're doing with PFAS, like what we're doing with nitrates in farm country, many environmental issues where we have deep expertise. But what we wanted to do in this report is get at some of the foundational reasons why things are going south from a conservation environmental standpoint here in Wisconsin. So over the course of much of 2022, Paul and I and about a dozen of our members kind of worked to try to get at what's the background on what's causing so many of our environmental issues for us to backtrack on. And so this report is really a reflection of that work, but it's certainly not the end of it. But our premise, our basic thesis in this report is that since 2011, state legislative actions, court rulings, and political practices have undermined democratic processes and have profoundly changed the way state government in Wisconsin operates. And as you all know, and as Robin mentioned, I know the League is fiercely nonpartisan as an organization. Wisconsin's Greenfire is also a nonpartisan organization, and we work with anyone and anybody who has an interest in the issues that we get involved with. We pulled off a feat, I think, of completing this entire report without mentioning the words Republican or Democrat. But I think voters and citizens can draw their own conclusions from the information that we've shared in this work. And what we're trying to do here is connect a couple of really distant dots between some of the really foundational changes in the way state government operates that for most people seem abstract and in the weeds. We're trying to tie that to some of what's been happening in our Wisconsin environment that has been not only deeply disturbing, but is threatening the health and the livelihood of Wisconsin citizens. And so among the really wide range of conservation issues where we've really walked backwards in the last decade, we focus especially on several issues revolving around clean water, because that is one of the most important assets for the quality of life and the health and the vitality of people and communities throughout this state. It's a fact that should be so obvious it shouldn't even need discussion, but what we're seeing right now are literally people drinking poisoned water, partly as a result of the failure of this state government to effectively act to try to prevent that. And Paul will be talking more about some of the specific outcomes that we've highlighted in the report. So what we try to do in the foundational piece of this project is look at 3 specific areas that have sort of impacted our ability of state government to function effectively for our best interests. And so in some ways we call this imbalance of power, and the thesis that we're kind of drawing on here is that over the course of the last decade, our state legislature has assumed more and more power for itself, and as a result has weakened or handicapped both our executive branch of state government, which is headed by our governor, as well as the work and the ability of local governments to function effectively and to act in a way that reflects the communities that they serve. So we dive specifically into some of the trends and restriction of local government authority, or what's often called local control, that it has really handicapped or handcuffed communities from being able to deal with emerging environmental issues. We also take a close look at the history of executive appointments to state agencies, and in particular, what's happened with the Natural Resources Board in Wisconsin. And finally, we take a deep dive down the complex world of administrative rules and how changes in the way administrative rules are developed has a profound effect on so many things that state government needs to do. So we'll talk about each one of those just a bit more. So first off, local control. You know, for many years in Wisconsin, there was a tradition that state government did the things that it needed to do, and local units of government, including counties, villages, towns, and cities, in general, had a fair amount of autonomy to create their own ordinances, and that has been changed dramatically since 2011, where we have seen just a pattern of continual restriction or elimination or prohibition of the ability of local units of government to act on their own behalf. 3 areas that we really point out as being critical. One is around CAFOs, the confined animal feeding operations, and the state legislature has continually restricted the ability of state governments to regulate or even prevent the sightings of CAFOs within their, local governments within their communities, to where today local communities and villages and towns have very little ability to prevent the sighting of these very large dairy operations or any large animal operation, despite the fact that they have profound environmental impacts that are not being effectively enough managed by the current regulations. We've seen similar restriction of local control around frac sand mining. The sand that has been mined, especially in western Wisconsin, from sandstone deposits, that's been a critical piece of the whole gas and oil fracking industry in the United States. A lot of that sand has come from Wisconsin, and that land use is a very large dramatic, highly impactful land use that was never contemplated under the current laws that exist today. And finally, we showcase what the impact on communities of restriction of their ability to control activities and land use around the shorelines of their lakes and rivers, and how communities are now basically prevented from having any more than the most minimal standards for what property owners are allowed to do along shorelines. So that's a foundational issue that we think needs to be addressed. We're also going to talk about executive appointments to boards and agencies. And in the case of this report, we focus specifically on the Natural Resources Board, which is where most of our program emphasis is, which is the board that oversees the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So you may have seen or known that in April 2021, Governor Evers appointed two women, one from Milwaukee, Sharon Adams, and one from Ashland, Sandra D. Nass, to the Natural Resources Board. Both people with varied and backgrounds, very qualified to represent their communities with some diverse perspectives. Sharon Adams has been allowed to be seated on the Natural Resources Board because the woman who was in that seat resigned when her term was over in May 2021. She still has not been confirmed by the Wisconsin Senate. Sandra Nass, however, has not been allowed to serve on the Natural Resources Board because of the fact that the person who is in her seat, Frederick Preen, has refused to resign his seat, even though his statutorily defined term ended in May of 2021. So for more than a year and a half, Fred Preen has squatted in that seat, preventing an eminently qualified member of the Natural Resources Board to be seated, and more importantly, preventing Governor Evers from a constitutionally appointed role to provide guidance to boards and agencies around the state. And this situation is not limited to the Natural Resources Board. However, unfortunately, the practice of doing this has been confirmed by a ruling by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And it's also been documented that Dr. Preen's actions have occurred in concert with members of the Wisconsin Senate who have agreed not to hold confirmation hearings on his replacement. And we just, along with others, point this out as a profound disruption of democratic norms in Wisconsin. So you may have also seen that finally, in late December of 2022, Frederick Preen finally resigned his seat after the election in which Governor Evers was, of course, reelected. So we all saw that as good news, and we can all assume that that's good news, but the story is not over. Provided that Sandra Nass is able to be seated, she may be able to begin serving on the Natural Resources Board, but the Senate is still bound to hold a confirmation hearing for her. It is, no one knows what the Senate's going to be inclined to do right now. After refusing to hold a hearing for a year and a half, it's possible that they'll hold a hearing right away to confirm her appointment. It's also possible that they'll hold a hearing and vote her down under claims that she's not qualified for the position, which we believe is a ridiculous claim given her background that I'll share a bit about in a minute. But actually in the next month, this may be a really critical period where the Wisconsin Senate needs to make a decision about how they're going to treat what should be a fairly normal process of confirming appointees of the governor to state boards and commissions. If they vote to reject her appointment, it could prevent a majority of members on that board being represented by Governor Evers, and could have profound impact on the continued ability of the Evers administration to accomplish their environmental agenda. So this is something that we'll talk more about in the discussion, but I think this is a place where citizen input could be really valuable. We'll share some background on Sandra Nass, but she has spent an entire career in the Chequamegon Bay area of northern Wisconsin as an educator, as a conservationist, as a consultant, as a county conservationist. She's a hunter, she's an angler. She has served on the Conservation Congress and on the County Deer Advisory Committee for Bayfield County. No one can claim with a straight face that she is not qualified to serve in this capacity. So more in the discussion on that when we start talking about things that all of us can do. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk about the rich subject of separation of powers and get down the road of administrative rules. So this is really basic, but I think that you all know that Wisconsin, as is almost every other state, has a structure of state government that in most respects mirrors the federal government, with a judiciary and an executive branch and a legislative branch. And the legislative branch primarily makes and passes laws, among other responsibilities. The judiciary manages both circuit courts as well as appeals courts and the ultimate state appeals court, which is the Supreme Court. And the executive branch, which includes a governor, lieutenant governor, and a cabinet of departments. And I'm showing a little bit more complex diagram here of Wisconsin state government. Robin, can everyone see the full amount of this slide? Yeah, okay. So you don't need to read all of this other than to understand that the executive branch within state government is complex and multifaceted. It includes all of the cabinet level agencies such as natural resources, but including Department of Transportation, Department of Children and Families, Department of Corrections. It's a long list of state agencies, as well as boards and commissions that oversee things like the UW system, the technical college system, the State Historical Society. There are a lot of moving parts to the executive branch of state government. A lot of those moving parts have been slowed down or ground down over the last 10 years as a result of the actions of our legislature. So another little bit of background here, and I wish we were in an auditorium where we could raise hands, but you all know that the Constitution of the state is sort of the ultimate authority for the legality and authority of state government to act. So if the Constitution is against it, you've got a problem. But underneath the Constitution, or following from the Constitution, we have what we normally think of as our laws, which are Wisconsin statutes. And those statutes are a collection of laws and bills that have been passed by the legislature, in most cases signed by the governor, and are what most of us think about as laws in Wisconsin. But there's another important piece of Wisconsin law, and that's the piece that we call administrative code, or also called administrative rules. And this is where I often ask for a show of hands of how many people are familiar with administrative rules, and often less than half of a room are not. And for the most part, you shouldn't have to be. But these are really the regulations that are developed by executive branch agencies to implement the direction given them in statutes, and which have themselves the force and effect of law. So administrative rules are a really critical piece of transparency and predictability in the way state government agencies operate. They provide certainty to regulated parties, to stakeholders, and the public as to how an agency will fulfill its legal responsibilities. They provide standards that may be numerical, they may be quantitative. They really are, you can think of them as the DNA of everything that state government does. And state government does a lot of things. It inspects the quality of the food service in your restaurant, and it approves the standards for the school bus that your children ride on to school. It creates standards for road construction and automobile safety. The list of administrative rules in Wisconsin is literally, if you stack them up, you're going to fill up a part of a room with the collection of administrative code that exists in Wisconsin. And that's true for the federal government, and it's true for every other state. If you look at just the natural resources rules that are the rules that affect the Department of Natural Resources, there are probably over 500 different chapters of administrative rules that affect us, that are really the guidance for Wisconsin DNR, on everything from water quality standards to what you're allowed to have on your dock, to the rules for bear hunting and elk hunting, to air and wastewater treatment. It's a long, long list, but again, this is sort of the critical piece of what gives our agencies the authority to do their work. Since 2011, our legislature has been on a mission to make it harder for state agencies to do their work. And what we document in this report is a series of statutory changes that really handicapped, made it harder to develop administrative rules and to implement them. In 2011, Act 21 created some new standards for explicit agency authority. It used to be understood that a state agency could promulgate a new rule as long as they had a general statutory authority to do so. Now the statute says that there has to be language in a bill that specifically says that an agency has the authority to do this thing. It also, the 2011 changes created a requirement for an economic impact analysis that forces agencies to, right down to the nickel, try to estimate the cost of implementing that rule, with no complementary requirement to estimate the benefit that would result from that rule. So there's in our opinion, a very myopic view of costs analysis that further limits agencies in developing new rules. And importantly, these changes have given much more authority to obscure legislative committee called the Joint Committee on Review of Administrative Rules, which now has the ability to effectively kill any rule they don't like without even having a public input. In 2017, an additional set of restrictions, and I hope you like my little Vice graphic there. I had some fun putting that together. Squeeze our state's ability to really act effectively. There is now also a new requirement that is the kiss of death for a lot of rules, and that is a 30-month, basically a 30-month stopwatch that starts the moment an agency begins work on a rule. And if that rule is not completed and approved at the end of 30 months, the rule dies. All the work on it dies. And that agency is required to go back to the square one and request approval to work on a rule again with what's called a new statement of scope. This is an incredibly inefficient and honestly destructive way to handicap agencies from being able to work on what in many cases are just complex challenges. So our assessment right now is that for especially complex or potentially controversial issues, the administrative rule process is broken. It simply is effectively non-functional for anything that is beyond a fairly simple thing that's going to have very little public controversy associated with it. And honestly, there aren't that many of those things. So without the ability to develop new rules in response to new issues, think of PFAS contamination as an example. Agencies simply can't respond to current events, and they can't effectively do their jobs, and that's leaving citizens in the lurch. So if you do take a closer look at our report, one of the things we do in chart form is just really showcase everything in red here is what you're seeing is our new restrictions or new abilities to basically stop, kill, or weaken administrative rules that have been implemented since 2011. And at this point, the result of all of this is that we're not even knowing the number of rules that should be developed that aren't even started, because agencies simply understand that they're not going to get it through this legislature. So we're losing in multiple ways as a result of this situation. So with that, that's a little bit of the background on what we're trying to assess in this report. Paul Heinen is going to follow me and talk a bit about some of the outcomes and also our recommendations. But first, Paul, I think you're going to tee up the video that we have from Mark Timke, who's one of our very active Greenfire members and who's added a lot to our work. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Fred. Good evening, everybody. I just want to make a couple of comments before we watch Mark's 15 minutes. And that's that you're going to hear Mark say things like, well, what Paul said, and when Paul and I work together, and you're going to be thinking, well, Paul hasn't said anything yet. It's the original webinar we did. Mark followed Fred and I. So anytime you hear when Paul said, just be thinking Paul will say, because it'll probably come up when I speak. And I also wanted to pass along with you, one of the things that's particularly interesting about having Mark Timke talk this way is for 40 years, Mark was on the other side of the table with me. He was a really premier business attorney, and we worked on a lot of things. And I lost a lot of environmental issues to Mark as he represented businesses, Paper Council, the Wisconsin manufacturers, a lot of the realtors, a lot of the very pro-business groups. But we worked together. And of particular interest to me is that 6 months before Mark retired, he came over to Greenfire because exactly what Fred was talking about, he saw on the ground, and he didn't like it anymore. He didn't like what his own clients were saying and doing in the business associations. So listen to Mark with that in mind. This is a man who made his career working for business. So if we want to start the video, I'll follow Mark when it's done.
Sounds good.
So next up will be Mark Timke. And Mark, I'll get our slideshow teed up again.
All right, thank you, Fred. Here we go. All right, thank you, and I'm glad to participate in the discussion today. And certainly all of the perspectives are very important.
We lost the sound. Fred, I don't know if there's something you can do, but we're not hearing this.
I'm on my own, advocating ideas and trying to move either rules or legislation or guidance in directions which I thought were productive and hopefully for people throughout the state. It does give perspective then, not only from what business looks at, but also from working within the system, as you will, and how it's changed over the years. Certainly, Paul and I were active in a number of these efforts over the years, and sometimes we're on different sides. We meet up at legislative committees and talk to each other at various times. But we tended to reach compromise and certainly know each other well and want to continue on in this work through Greenfire. I want to take just a couple of minutes here to give you a little bit of a business perspective and some thoughts on, as Fred mentioned, where things have broken down, not only for citizens, but for the business as citizens in the state, and some thoughts on, given where we are, where we might be going. I think one of the overarching aspects from, in many ways, as to why we're here is to understand that we really haven't had new environmental laws that govern a lot of the business activities since the last one being in 1990. And most of the laws were in the late 70s or 80s. That means we're dealing with legal programs that are 40, maybe 50 years old, based on a very different time, a very different situation, and a very different paradigm for how regulatory programs should work. So since we haven't been able to enact any new environmental laws, Congress doesn't seem to do it. The state legislature has trouble doing it. There's been a lot of reliance on rulemaking as the fallback. And so rules are put out to try to adapt to the new situations that have come up. And rulemaking over the last 10 years, as Fred noted, has become very, very difficult. So now we've moved to guidance. Guidance has become difficult to deal with. And so now we're working with a fair amount of uncertainty and inability to adapt to new conditions and new situations. From a business standpoint, what we really business likes is stable regulatory programs and being part of the process. So as a large Fortune 500 company environmental director once told me, he said, "We may not like the program, but if it's stable, I can manage it." Meaning that I know how to deal with it. I know what the rules are. I can manage my budget. I can manage my expectations. I can deal with agencies. I can do training. I can have audits for compliance, and I know what's going on. So stability is one of the parts that is important to business on these kind of programs. At the same time, business changes, business activities change. We've certainly seen that in the state where the paper industry at one time was dominant in the state and no longer is. There's different types of businesses and different needs. And so programs need to have sufficient flexibility to accommodate one-off situations. The ability to do that now is more difficult, and that creates a problem for the business community as well. The other aspect from a business perspective is participation. Just like Paul and everyone talking here has talked about being part of the process, being engaged, to deal with programs. For example, the water improvement programs that occurred that helped the Wisconsin and Fox Rivers occurred in a participation format. People may not have been entirely favorable with the results on either side, but there was participation and phase-in of any kind of new or substantially changed programs. PFAS is an example where, because the programs didn't promote participation and phase-in, that didn't occur, and we're seeing substantial pushback on the business side because they really weren't feeling engaged in part of the process. Next slide. So what we had for a long time, and what Paul and I dealt with during those years that he's mentioned, things worked well, and I thought they worked well as in developing regulatory programs, was a consensus model. We really in the state were one of these states that had a negotiated regulatory program, which meant that we would have committees of internal and external experts. They were committed to a goal, which was to map out a regulatory program. I spent many, many hours and several years developing our current remediation code through that kind of process on my volunteer time. DNR asked me to spend 6 months. I spent 4 years. But we achieved the goal. It was built around communication, discussion of key issues. I will say that discussions weren't sometimes heated. Sometimes we all expressed our positions, but we found ways to compromise and come out to an understanding on the issues. This takes time to achieve, but it does have long-term lasting results where people buy into the rules and buy into the program. This whole process would occur before formal rulemaking was ever commenced. So the rulemaking process was kind of at the tail end, was a process that we all went through, and maybe there were tweaks, small changes that occurred, but it wasn't a major change to the compromise that was achieved. So even though there were disputes, the compromises stood, and they stood at the Natural Resources Board, and they stood at the legislature, and we were able to move programs forward. Next slide. So we did have the breakdown in this consensus approach. Fred had an excellent slide of all the changes that has occurred. Principally, the legislature imposed substantial process requirements on rulemaking, and time limits were added to rulemaking, such that you couldn't have these pre-negotiated rules, because DNR couldn't talk to you about rulemaking unless there was a scope statement. Scope statement started a time clock. A scope statement had to go through hearings. You couldn't have the kind of back and forth open discussions that were helpful in the prior process. And so DNR started to pull away and not have advisory committees that were productive in reaching consensus. And so that whole process tended to break down. DNR, because of all of these process requirements and timelines, adopted more of what I will call a comment and response approach. So instead of sitting down at a table and negotiating and working through language, working through issues, DNR would put out items for comment. You'd make a response. They'd go back into their process. You wouldn't know what was going on, and then suddenly they would come out with language or changes, but it wasn't in a negotiated type basis. So you would point out where there may be issues, and they may or may not respond to those. So really was a breakdown in that kind of consensus building approach. And so, people tended to go into their respective corners and look for ways to fight each other. And right now, from a business standpoint, they're going, why do we participate in the DNR process anymore? So we'll just use the Natural Resources Board or the legislature as where we want to go, because ultimately they have the authority, they have the power in this process, and they can be used as a block, or we can negotiate what we want at that stage rather than trying to work through the rulemaking process. So that breakdown, which Fred has mentioned and Paul has mentioned, certainly has occurred. Slide. This breakdown, then how do we approach it? And I'm saying the breakdown affects both businesses and citizens looking at rulemaking. And those of us who are looking for good programmatic policy to deal with current conditions and not things that are issues out of the 1970s or 1980s on which these laws and many of the rules are based. So traditional rulemaking for these kind of changes, as we've all seen with a number of the rulemakings, is very difficult, resource intensive, and very uncertain as a process. Certainly DNR, devoted 30 months, and I devoted time to changing some of the remediation codes around them, update them, deal with current issues, and part of those rules included PFAS. Those rules all fell apart, even though there were changes within those rules, which made sense for both the environment and for business to promote, say, brownfield redevelopment to occur in a faster and a better format. And those rules were lost, and those changes did not occur. So it's not been just simply a block, it's been a block on many policy items which were good for the state. So where do we deal with that? Michigan faced a very similar problem earlier than Wisconsin. What has gone on in Michigan is to simply bypass the rule approach altogether, not invest the substantial resources and time in rules that don't go anywhere, and simply go to where the people are who make the decisions, and that's at the legislature. And I've certainly done that in the past, where I wanted innovative programs to move forward. And one of the panels I'm on is the EDGE program, and that's an innovative program to promote brownfield redevelopment with community involvement. We got that passed at the legislative level and didn't go through rulemaking to do it. So the downside to that is you end up with very detailed laws, which used to be rules, but now they're laws. Legislators don't have time to work on detailed environmental policy and laws or understand it. And is that the best approach? But at least it gets something potentially done. And you see that in Michigan, if you look at their environmental laws, they are extremely detailed and look like rules, but they're put into the legislature because that was the only way to deal with it. The other is to try and get innovative. It's a one-off approach, but we do have what we call Greenfire in Wisconsin for those entities, be they municipalities or businesses, which want to be progressive on environmental programs. And there are a number of businesses and municipalities that want to do that. And it allows for you to be able to structure and affect your own type of regulatory program under this Greenfire umbrella. But you need to be progressive, you need to be innovative, and you need to be having community involvement in the Greenfire program. It tends to avoid significant blocks. It's an underused program. It's not a pure substitute for what we had in the past, but if we have to live within the existing structure we have, it is a tool that right now is underutilized, and we really ought to think about empowering the use of this program more at the Department of Natural Resources, and citizens and municipalities and businesses looking at it as a way to achieve better environmental programs in the state.
Okay, I think that wraps it up for Mark. So I'll stop sharing and Paul, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Fred. I'm just going to build on what Fred and Mark have both been talking about. Talking a little bit about real life impacts on PFAS, nitrates, shoreline zoning, talk about executive appointments at the end, and then talk about some recommendations that I hope lead to some really good conversation in the webinar today. So, Mark talked about PFAS and other pollutants that have been nearly impossible, as Fred was talking about, to get anything done because we can't pass rules. Rules are what we use to regulate those things. And we've done hundreds and hundreds of rules to work on pollutants and chemicals over the course of my 40 years at DNR, and certainly before that. And with PFAS, they're hardly the first emerging contaminant. One of the best ways I can tell you about this is the ex-deputy secretary at DNR, Todd Ames, who worked in water programs for his whole career, used to start his PFAS speech by saying, I'm going to hear from the opposition, and I have heard from the opposition, that they say it's too expensive, and they say it's too much bureaucracy. And, hold it. Now, that was Mercury in 1970. Oh, I remember. They're going to say that we can't do these regulations and stay in Wisconsin. The cost of it, oh no, that was sulfur dioxide in the 1980s. And then he, much better than I'm doing, he goes on to talk about aldecarb and CFCs. CFCs are those chlorofluorocarbons that were making the ozone hole, which we stopped, cleaned up, and the ozone hole is filling in. It will be completely filled in 40 years. It was a newspaper story this morning. We've been doing these kinds of things in Wisconsin until 2010, all along. And when I say doing it, the process is really quite simple. A problem is identified either by citizens or by the Department of Health. They work to get the science to get pulled together so you can make a standard. That standard starts regulation. It's called the preventive action limit. So when the staff get together, and I'll just use a number, say it needs to be 100, they take that to the board agrees because the scientists have said that. Scientists, or the rule goes past the board to the legislature, they pass it, and now you have a law that was set by rule. Well, it doesn't happen anymore. And with the last PFAS group of rules, there was 3 rules: drinking water, groundwater, surface water. Groundwater, didn't pass. We have no PFAS protection for groundwater, zero. And the federal government doesn't regulate it. So we have to pass that one. For surface waters, the suggested was 20. We got 70, 3.5 times more because of the Natural Resources Board and how it is controlled. We did get a drinking water standard of 20, which was what was asked for. So one of the 3 standards was passed by the board. Good news is now, as Fred was saying, Sandy Nass will be on the board, and it's very likely DNR will push for that PFAS groundwater standard and likely update other standards too. But recall, when you remember as Fred was talking about 30 months, that's how long it's going to take. Maybe a little shorter because PFAS kind of just went through the process. But everybody, this is our drinking water, and we're going to continue to drink it until we have a standard. And then once those standards are put in place, everybody, it takes 5 years to have that standard put in place because it will be done at the end of a permit. Everybody has permits, wastewater, whatever else. So the rule passes, you got to wait till the end of the permit, and then new standards will be put in. 7 years at least until you get cleaner drinking water. That's just wrong. It's, your kids, everybody's drinking this stuff. Nitrates is another issue. We've been addressing nitrates for a long time. But like I was saying, what happens is that over time, this professional staff, outside consultants, the Mark Timkes of the world, are finding that okay, the old standard doesn't work, or the old standard may be too stringent and it needs to be pulled back. That happens in some cases, rarely, but it does happen. But again, the 2 agencies, health and DNR, get together and say, now we have to update these standards. So they did that for nitrates in 2016 is when they started. Last year in 2022, early 22, they gave up and said, we can't pass it through the board and we can't get it through the legislature. And they would have had to do a very expensive economic analysis, Fred talked about, which would give the legislature a huge number because it would be statewide with no benefit number. They don't have to do, and they, matter of fact, the legislature doesn't want to hear about the benefit side. What will it cost? Well, it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to save people's lives and save a lot of money in terms of health costs and other things on the environment. Don't want to hear about it. So that's the way the current rule process is set up for nitrates. Something that has amazed me as somebody who's worked in government so long is shoreline zoning. If you think about sitting out on a boat, maybe you got your bottom in the water, you're looking at a lakeshore, maybe a pier sticking out with a window up on the cabin up there. Or if there's no shoreline zoning, you're looking at a McMansion with lawns right down to the metal seawall, and there's nothing, there's no life going between that water and that land. Imagine being a frog. Hey, how do I get up there? They don't. And that's why the legislature, back when I was working in the legislature and lobbying for the department, passed shoreline zoning ordinances. They gave local units of government basically a base number and a base thing for regulation. And then we allowed local governments to figure out how best to do their shoreline zoning. Who knows better? The DNR person in Madison or the person living on the lake with all of his constituents and neighbors? Well, we thought it was the local folks. I guess we were wrong. The legislature passed, what the legislature did was take those minimums and make them the maximum, one maximum, statewide, fits all bodies of water. Local governments can't say, well, that doesn't work here. Too bad. We said it does. So since the 60s, we had been adopting new ordinances. And you think about water bodies too. The levels of water, the land that the water affects is constantly changing. Well, we're not doing anything about it. 60 years later, we have basically just the one size fits all for shoreline zoning. Number one problem that any county employee working with water or state employee will talk about, that it's ruining our water and there's nothing they can do. Very odd thing too, because the majority party at that time used to really want local government to be the decision makers and not state government. That's flipped. It's not that way anymore. They say what's good, local governments be damned. And one of the issues Fred talked about, of course, quite a bit, but the executive appointments. This is astounding to me for somebody who has worked in government and who has seen one natural resources board member in my 40 years not be appointed or get a hearing before the fiasco of the last 2 years. One. 127 total appointees. So that's transportation, other boards, ag, university boards, whatever. 127 of the people that Governor Evers needs and appointed to help him run government because he got elected have not served. They are not, they have not been voted on by the Senate. The Senate has to vote on, it's called confirming. They have to confirm these people. It's just so blatantly political. I mean, there's no reason to hold a hearing. If you don't like them, vote them down. That's certainly within the Senate's power, but they just don't do anything and don't tell you why they're not doing anything. But the good news is, in terms of the Natural Resources Board, that Doc Preen has finally stepped down and Sandra Noss can serve now until she's either, well, until she's voted down. She can serve if she's voted up or they just don't vote for her. But so it's just something that kind of over and above all the other things that are going on, you've got a political system that doesn't allow the governor who got, you know, more votes than the other side, don't allow them to do the job that the people elected for. That's it's not good news. But thankfully, Doc has stepped down. And also thankfully in May, the Natural Resources Board has 3 more Evers appointees. So it'll be 4-3 as of this month when Sandra Noss takes her first meeting. And then it'll be 7-0 in May next year. I'm sorry, yeah, in May of this year. So Robin, you want to put up the, or Fred, the recommendations? It's not all great news what I was talking about. Sorry about that. But I hope that when I'm done here in a minute, we can talk about things that we all can do. And I almost feel like I'm singing to the choir about citizen engagement. It's what you do. But I guess I'll make the pitch for, on the natural resources side of things, you can engage every single month with the Natural Resources Board. They take virtually all the citizen input, and they generally listen very closely to what people say. And if there are 30 people saying something, it's a lot better than 2 people saying something. So really engage. Same thing for the legislature. I've gone to hearings now for 40 years, and pretty much in the last 5 years, because people have become so frustrated with government, it's me and the other lobbyists. Seldomly do I see a public member. And it's almost like when a public member comes in, people are like, oh, cool, somebody else is going to talk. Because we all have been hearing ourselves for our whole careers. It's really nice to get input from people who are being affected. And so seldomly do people do that anymore. And it's really valuable, particularly with your own legislator. Legislators are, you're the boss of your legislator. You know, if they're in the other party, you may not think that way. But the fact of the matter is they care a lot about what you say. And then, of course, being involved in other organizations, not only the League, which is really highly respected, just so you know. I'll say that even as a legislative aide, that when the League of Women Voters said something, we listened within the legislature. So, but depending upon the issue area that you're interested in, either Robin or I would be more than happy to lead you to, there's so many good groups out there that it's really effective. They have 20,000 other members saying, or you're talking for them. It means some time, of course, but you guys know that because of your work with the League. So can we go to the policy reforms then, Robin? The next slide is just going to say it's going to be
That would
policy.
be Fred. Fred, can you advance the
Oh, I'm
slide?
sorry.
Yes, I may have a little glitch here, forgive me.
Oh, and that's what, Fred, don't worry about it. I've got him in front of me. What
All
I'm
right.
going to talk about is certainly if you are getting involved and want to get involved, talking about changing that idiotic rulemaking process, even something as easy as, okay, I understand why you want an economic analysis. I want a benefit analysis along with the economic analysis. I want to be able to weigh both of those things, not just hear about how much it's going to cost. Changes to local control. I'm still amazed. I would think the mayors and the county boards and all those local board people would certainly be talking about wanting to get back that power that they had before so they can handle the situations. They cannot handle the situations. And maybe legislators don't think it's making a difference to the water quality. I'm guessing they do. And I'm guessing that when the builders and realtors talk in their other ear, they decide to listen to that. So getting engaged there would be a very important thing to do. And then there will be legislation introduced, likely not going to be heard because the majority party probably doesn't want to hear it, on when somebody is appointed by the governor, put some time limits on it, have a hearing and have a vote. Vote them down, be public about it, don't hide. And, these are just 3 or 4 of the biggest things that you can get involved in. And if we want to talk more about how to do that, I'll gladly do it. But thank you all for listening, and questions and answers are, Fred and I are ready.
Very good. We have quite a few questions here. Let's see, I'm trying to group them. There's some about the green tier program that was mentioned, a question about what is it and how would the green tier program, this is from another viewer, how would the green tier program turn our CAFO and PFA, PFO and nitrate problems around?
Green tier was built on the assumption that if you were a super performer for a company, we would, I'm sorry, I was there at DNR when I lobbied for this. DNR would allow you to maybe not do as many reports and paperwork. You got kind of more of a free rein because you're doing so much more anyway. When it comes to the legislature not doing things like on PFAS or whatever, you could use the green tier model, and that's what Mark was talking about, to go to companies that if they would voluntarily get rid of their PFAS, if they would do testing, whatever the various things that we could say, you're a super performer, you could allow them more leeway. So in a way, it's a program that allows good actors to be better actors and not have to worry about the regulations.
Good, thank you. Could you please recap the role of the NRB, which also explain what that is, their authority, power, and limits to power? I think broad misconceptions abound. For example, I've heard the NRB rights legislation, which I'm not so sure is true.
Yeah, thanks. We probably could have done a better job of explaining that up front. We use acronyms when we live with it all the time, but the NRB is the Natural Resources Board, and that board is sort of established as the guiding board that directs the work of the Natural Resources Department, which was created in 1967, I think, as a result of a reorganization of state government. Now, for a long time, the Natural Resources Board had more authority than it does now, including the responsibility to select and appoint the secretary of the DNR. And under Governor Thompson, that authority was removed from the Natural Resources Board. So today, the DNR operates under a little bit of a hybrid system where the governor appoints the secretary, and the other key political appointments that basically run the agency, the division administrators and the secretary, assistant secretaries. But the Natural Resources Board, which is appointed by governors under staggered 6-year terms, is responsible for approving administrative rules, of all kinds, and approving master plans and approving, typically they approve things like the department's plans for the bear hunt or any number of other environmental programs. But the NRB cannot write its own laws. Their authority is really limited to acting on the plans and proposals that are brought to them by the department. And Paul, correct me if there's anything I missed there.
Nope. Well done.
Okay, we have a number of questions about water. For which ground surface drinking water contaminants is there strong, clear scientific evidence regarding safe toxic levels? Which pollutants require significant further study to determine a safe toxic levels? Please address various members of the PFAS family in particular. And okay, yeah, let's just take that one question. I won't build on that one. I'll save the
That one may be a little deeper than either of us want to go. But Paul, you want to take a stab at it?
Sure, and you're not going to like the answer. There are thousands of PFAS compounds. There are about, I think the last I heard, about 180 being looked at for regulations. The three that you all hear about and we're talking about is PFAS, PFOAs, and then PFAHXs. Three of the hundreds, and those hundreds are part of thousands of PFAS. Now, having said that, they're not all really toxic. They aren't all long lasting. But the fact of the matter is we are going after the kind of the top bad compounds. And what we're finding is there are problems. I mean, obviously people in La Crosse and east side of Madison, Peshtigo, et cetera, have very high limits. Likely most people do not have limits that I was talking about, those that hit the preventive standard. But as far as we know, all of us have PFAS in our bodies because we've been, they've been around for our whole lives. Obviously, thankfully, not enough to make us sick, but we have them. And therefore, you've got a little bit of a problem because we don't know what to tell people and doctors don't know what to tell people. How do you know if it's PFAS that you're getting or has it been one of these other 1,800 compounds? So it's really a tough issue still, but those are the kind of, there's a 2 or 3 few that we know are health problems. Those are the ones we tried to get numbers on, and one of them we got numbers.
so along that same line, you said that there's PFAS rules for a limit of 20 in drinking water, some in surface water, but nothing in groundwater. How does that affect people that are getting their drinking water from wells, which so many are?
Yeah, it's a huge omission that we had the opportunity to deal with a year ago and that the Natural Resources Board prevented from happening. So it's something like a third of Wisconsin residents get their water from private wells, not from municipal water supplies. And for all of those people, there is still no state or federal standard for a safe level of PFAS in their groundwater. And there's also still really, we're the tip of the iceberg in terms of the amount of well testing that needs to happen is being done right now. So we really got a whole class of citizens in this state who are vulnerable and lacking even knowing whether they should have a problem or not.
2 pieces of good news. Oh, go ahead, Robin.
Well, I was just going to say, Fred, can you explain the difference that private wells would be affected by a groundwater standard, but municipal wells are affected by a drinking water standard? Could you just clarify that?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. So the 3 standards, 3 rules that the Natural Resources Board considered at one time together last year, the drinking water standard, as Robin said, would apply to municipal or public water supplies or any regulated water supply that might be a university campus, for example, or something. So we do have a rule for that. The surface water standard would really take into account environmental issues. But the groundwater standard is the standard that would apply to anything that would be, taken up by a private well for drinking water. So people in rural Wisconsin who are not attached to municipal water supplies are the ones who are vulnerable and for whom the groundwater rule is not there.
Two pieces of good news.
Yep.
They have restarted the PFAS groundwater rule. It's called a scope statement, and when it was approved by the Natural Resources Board at the December meeting. So hopefully within a year or so, because we just did this rule, so it may not take the whole 3 years, we may have a new rule in place. Recall, then those rules have to be put into their, although not for groundwater standards. Groundwater standards would be right away. Second piece of good news is there's a bootload of federal money coming into Wisconsin for PFAS. Testing, cleanup, the staff at DNR, so you got people watching what's going on. And by hopefully mid next year, a lot of the money will start being spent.
Yep.
So particularly those of you who are in places where, you need to spend a couple of $10 million to filter your money, the money will be there. It's real money to take care of the problem.
That opens up a whole lot of other questions on how that money will be delegated, but
Right.
let's continue. We've got a number of questions on rulemaking. One is, why is the 30-month time limit so short or too short? And could you provide some examples about the rulemaking process, like an example where it worked well and another where it did not?
Well, I'll just mention the 30-month rule, and then Paul, you should give those examples. The fact of the matter is, as you listen to Mark's discussion, hopefully you came away with some understanding of how complex the decision-making is around some of these things. So, rule packages include a lot of discussion with affected stakeholders that takes time to manage the public input. And then there's bringing all the science to the table, developing numerical standards if those are involved. All of that is just, especially with an agency whose staff level has been continually reduced by budgets that have forced them to reduce their number of positions, and the number of rural processes that are going on at any one time. It's just a capacity issue. So the 30-month guillotine on rural processes is just punitive. There's no good purpose to have that.
Fred, could you clarify also, DNR staff are not allowed to even talk about the rule. Like you cannot have any communication to start up any of these until after the scope statement is approved and that clock starts. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, so there's no pre-work that can happen, as you said, Robin. They can't even talk about it, outside of a water cooler. So it's just, rules of the game are designed to make the system fail. And when you read the way those rules are written, it's pretty clear. But Paul, you've got some examples.
Sure. How does the rulemaking process work when it works well? I can think of the recycling law. Groundwater law would have been the same. Recycling law, the bill passed. It said thou shalt recycle. They gave DNR 38 staff people to do the job. They didn't cut people. They gave us 38 new staff people. Then we went out and talked to businesses that were going to recycle, all the municipalities, to talk about, how does this work? What's the best way of doing this? A dime? How about we put a dime charge on every bottle and can, and everybody will bring that back? Yeah, that went pretty far, but generally people said, no, we don't want to do that. Particularly the grocers, who said, what are we going to do with these things? We have to have a whole new store, a whole new building the size of our store to store these bottles and cans. So invariably we have the current system we have now, where you have pickup sites and some go to recycling and some go to others. But that all was done by the people that were out there. The legislature had passed a law and said recycling is good. Now you guys go ask the public why and how. We do the same things in terms of nitrates or phosphates. And I just picked those as two other pollutants. You go to the health people, they say anything over 5 is likely going to affect people. You put a limit of 5 on, you kind of work it back and forth. Some people say, well, we can't not put out this much, so they do something else. You negotiate. You ask them what to do. Is it a long process, and do some businesses dislike it? Yes, they do. Probably all of them, because it adds some cost on, etc. But they're getting to pollute your environment. So the argument I continually made was small cost for you to be able to continue to pollute. Why don't you pay for it? And so that's a good way for rules to work.
And something that Mark pointed out in his talk is that there was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when affected parties were willing to be at the table,
right,
and be part of negotiating what that regulation would ultimately look like. And there are some sectors of the business community that have simply decided that they don't want to be at the table anymore. And they have the ability to kill these processes. So they're not seeing any incentive to cooperate. But in many respects, and Mark has pointed this out, everybody loses when that's the case. And even the industries lose because they don't have the certainty of a level playing field for their competitors that they would have had with a regulation that everybody could live with.
There's a question, can a citizen express interest in being on the NRB? And maybe also, how is the best way to communicate with members of the NRB about concerns?
You go to the governor's website, and there is a portal for people who want to have positions, and they're asking people to please apply for the new NRB positions. Starting in May, there'll be the final 3. So yes, please do get civically engaged. That's fantastic. There is a email list of all of the Natural Resources Board members. It's on the DNR website. Just type in Natural Resources Board. And yes, you can get, that's what they do. They don't get paid, but they do a lot of reading. And people, contact them a lot with their opinions. And, I'll tell you the truth, I've known hundreds of Natural Resources Board members, and they really do appreciate that. They want to hear from the public.
Well, this is about the upcoming spring elections. Will the upcoming Supreme Court election outcome potentially influence any of the issues that we're speaking of tonight?
Well, certainly the referendum on not allowing the governor to spend federal money will big time influence. If you let the legislature have any input on that, you are asking for a lengthy period of time. Right now, that money, I was talking about the buco federal money coming in, goes to the governor. The next day, it goes to the state agency. The next week, the state agency is spending the money on PFAS, on renewable energy. I mean, there's literally hundreds of things that the federal money is coming down for, and it's all going right on. Building roads, everything else. Now the legislature said, whoa, 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 give it to us, and then we'll dole it out. I can't think of a worse idea, I'm sorry, in terms of trying to get it out there. And then, of course, for the Supreme Court race, the balance of the court is pretty much tied right now. So if it goes a little bit more conservative, if you vote for a conservative, or a little bit more liberal, that will affect the kinds of decisions that the court will make.
Here's a question and a comment from someone who is a group that is hoping to eliminate the WCC, as Wisconsin is the only state that has a non-functioning group like this. What are your thoughts on eliminating the WCC? And maybe you could comment what the WCC is for viewers.
Yeah, that's the Wisconsin Conservation Congress, I presume they're referring to. And that's a somewhat unique structure in Wisconsin that most other states don't have, that I think was really the brainchild of Aldo Leopold, or he was one of the people who really advocated for it. But it's intended to be a democratic, grassroots, sort of community-led body that would advise the Natural Resources Department on primarily conservation and environmental issues. So Wisconsin Conservation Congress has chapters in every county of the state. Every spring, there are county hearings where every county chapter comes together and they have a whole set of questions on everything from duck hunting and trout fishing to water quality to whatever citizens want to have posted as questions for the Congress to consider. There's a democratic process for nominating those questions. I think the group today ideally would represent the whole spectrum of interests of people who, from cities to rural areas, not just fishing and hunting, but people who care about clean water, people who care about green spaces and public lands and trees and all the other things that the Natural Resources Department, the DNR, is responsible for. I think the reality today is that the WCC tends to be much more focused on fishing and hunting and doesn't have nearly as much focus on all those other environmental issues that are important to all of us. I personally think that there's opportunity to reform the Wisconsin Conservation Congress or to breathe new life into it. And one of our recommendations is that every single one of us on this webinar is eligible to become a delegate to the Conservation Congress. And I think if more people with different backgrounds were involved, it might really help that organization stay relevant.
Here is a question that might be quick. What was the vote on the Pelican River Forest Preservation held up by a rule?
It's not being held up by a rule, it's being held up by a legislator who we now know who it is. It's Senator Felskowski. She's come out publicly. There's a committee called the Joint Finance Committee. Whenever there's a big purchase, they have to sign off on it. Oftentimes northern legislators do not because they're worried about the tax base. And in this case, that's what Senator Felskowski is worried about. So it's been held up, but the word now on the street is that some of the local people who are holding it up for certain easements and things along roadways that the department is more than willing to talk to them about. So I'm thinking that'll break relatively soon.
I think that issue, though, points out something that we didn't address in the Opportunities Now report, but that is equally important in terms of sort of democracy and action and conservation. And that is that the Joint Finance Committee that Paul mentioned, they have provisions in the current law that allows anonymous objections so that a project of any size that is required to come to the Joint Finance Committee for approval, any member of that committee can anonymously object and never have their identity known. And that it by itself can be enough to kill a project. And Gathering Waters, which is the statewide umbrella group for land trusts in the state, has really been active on that issue, as they should be. It's another undemocratic norm that we really need some reforms on.
I know we are just about out of time here, Robin. To wrap up, there's still a lot of very interesting questions. Maybe we can look at some of these and try to get some answers. There's a lot of concern about PFAS in the water, in the Great Lakes, all across the state. That's, I would say, an overriding theme in a lot of the questions in the manufacturing of, PFAS. And so this is an area of great concern for most people.
So Anne Marie, why don't we look at those questions that haven't been asked yet? I can work with Fred and Paul, and we can get responses to those and email them out to the registrants of the webinar. And I think we have all that contact information.
That would be great. And one thing I'd add, maybe we can include this in that follow-up. We still don't know the end of the story with Sandra Naas. We still don't know what the Senate committee is going to do with her appointment. And right now, I think there is an opportunity for citizens to make it known that she deserves to be confirmed. And we can include some information about her within that packet also for anyone who's interested.
Yep. Thank you for the opportunity to talk, everybody.
Well,
This has been great.
Yeah, I really appreciate your insights and putting this report together and sharing it with the League of Women Voters. I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us, and I want to mention that your local leagues have a variety of programs throughout the year that may be of interest to you, and that I'm going to try to share my screen here one more time and see if I can pull up. No, it's not working. I'm just going to stop. I let you know that, for example, the League of Women Voters of the Greater Chippewa Valley's next program is going to be on civility in the public arena, and you can go to their website for more information on that. And for the League of Women Voters in lacrosse, our next program, which is next Tuesday, is going to feature Lisa Graves, who's president of the Center for Media and Democracy, who's going to talk about the need for fair courts and what's undermining Wisconsin courts. A timely topic considering the spring election is coming up for a state Supreme Court. And so check out our websites and you'll find ways to register for programs across the state. And hopefully your local league will present a wide variety of topics that will help you stay engaged in our democracy. So with that, thank you all for joining us. We're really pleased that you're able to listen, and we'll get back with you on responses to those questions. Have a great evening. Be safe and stay warm. And thank you to Fred and Paul and to Mark by video.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Take care.